women to set boundaries.
I would just like everyone to know that I was cut off from speaking before we started this episode.
Well, okay, so hear me out. When I'm trying to sync up the audios on the video and on our GarageBand, it gets real hard when there's lots of and then I'm trying to figure it out. So I did very kindly ask quiet on the set before we begin.
I just think it's funny because when I'm told to not do something, I just want to be like very inappropriate and say something off the cuff.
Well, you know that if you would have been like, I'd have been like, okay, fair. That one actually might be easy to link up.
Yeah.
Just do the really high.
It's true.
Thingies.
Anyway.
But anywho, episode 3, it only took us 10 minutes to set up this time.
Yeah, we did great.
It was very easy.
Shout out to you and your tech wizardry.
Oh, please. Don't even. You like connected all the things.
I plugged in one little
and that one was
dongle.
Probably the most important one.
I mean, it was actually. It did the flux capacitor into the wall.
It does.
I don't know what it's actually called.
Connects all the pieces to the ultimate piece.
And yeah,
of electricity.
I literally did nothing. Thanks for the blue ribbon, though. I appreciate it. Well, welcome back to Couch Convos, the podcast where we peel behind the curtain of mental health and talk about life as therapists, give you all tips and tricks as to how to manage life things, and just kind of our overall musings on happenings.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder, this is not therapy. Please seek out any kind of immediate action needed if you are feeling unsafe, 988 or your hospital setting. But yeah, so today we're talking boundaries.
Yay, 'tis the season.
La, 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 la.
I honestly feel like there's definitely a vibe shift in the room when we talk about holidays. Even like with us right now, I could tell we're both feeling a little bit anxious talking about this.
There's been a lot of changes this holiday season, which is not necessarily bad. It's just change is difficult.
No, I agree. And I do feel like the fact that even us as therapists experience discomfort should just show that this is very much like a universal stressor around this time of year.
Oh yeah, especially Christmas, because you involve like gifts and such, whereas Thanksgiving, that's like family, food, thankfulness, whereas Christmas is the first time that you're kind of like, okay, we're all together, we're all gonna eat a lot of food, and we're going to share gifts that potentially could upset people or make people really happy. Even though it's not supposed to matter that much. But it definitely does matter that much.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. I just hope you got me the best gift ever.
So then before we launch into like the clinical therapist side of the holidays, what are the holidays like for you as a human being? You mentioned that they're just different right now.
Yeah, so I'm in a new relationship. This is our first Christmas that we're doing together. Last Christmas we did not do together. We did like our families kind of thing, 'cause it was relatively early on. So this is the first time that I'm doing like Christmas with my person, with my family, and then Christmas with his family. And so like maneuvering that is interesting. And then also like, how do you get gifts for your partner's mom,
second cousin,
dad,
twice removed.
So we've had a lot of conversations around like, what would your mom and dad want? And I'm like, I'm still trying to work on what I'm getting my mom and dad. And then just kind of like when you get older, I feel like telling people the gifts that you would like, it's like I'd love to get a Kroger gift card so I can buy some cereal.
A new vacuum.
Yeah.
That's a luxury gift though, honestly.
Right. But then also like trying to buy gifts for other older people.
Yeah. It's a great idea though, Kroger gift card.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that.
Just groceries, just the necessities.
Yeah. I remember asking for like gas gift cards in college and grad school. I don't know why I stopped.
I know they're really helpful,
especially right now.
But there's been lots of changes for your Christmas.
Yeah, so I think Christmas this year, I'm really trying to make it special again. I used to love Christmas, and that changed a few years ago, and then I just got really sad around the holidays. It was just like really dark, and it was not a good time to be in my brain. But starting this year, my husband and I have been really trying to change that a little bit. And so like we've been starting our own traditions, and also seeing the holidays through a child's eyes just instantly makes it more magical. Like it's really sweet. I actually saw my nephew last night, and he was like talking to the elves, and we were reading Christmas books together, and he was making little snowman crafts. So it's obviously a lot easier when I have like a little one and who is all about the magic. So I'm really trying to get the joy back in the holidays, but it is an uphill battle for sure. Especially as like we have multiple families to split holidays now, and it just gets complicated. And you definitely feel like, what was it? There was a meme where it's like, oh, I remember the times where all my holidays were spent in the car going from one holiday to the other. It's like, yeah, that one.
Yeah, you feel that. Especially because your families, they're relatively close. But I think for you, at least, it's good that because you guys are splitting.
Yes.
Whereas, like, with Kyle and I, we're almost too close. Like, it's an hour and a half.
It's the same day.
Yes, so it becomes like a same day kind of thing. Oof. So it does become like we're gonna drive up, and then we're gonna drive back, and then we're gonna drive here, and it's just like you don't get the quality time that you're looking for to have for the holidays sometimes.
So that Kroger gift card that you're looking for in the gas
for
department.
gas. Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah, and I'm a BP girly, sadly.
I'm
I
a
know
QT, y'all.
Are you really?
I am.
I do love QT.
It's a good one. I like the slushies.
They have the slushie. And they have really good milkshakes. The swirl or the swerve.
I need to try
I think
that.
they're called something. Yeah, they got a peanut butter.
Pop a lactate before I go.
Get all the cheese.
So in the last 2 episodes, I don't know how this came up, but I've mentioned that I like math. And so I looked up some data about the holidays. And so according to the American Psychological Association, 38% of people disclosed increased stress over the holidays, which honestly, that seemed a little bit low in my head. But as we know with statistics, like self-report bias,
right?
You know, take that with a grain of salt. And then the National Alliance of Mental Illness reported that 64% of people who have a diagnosed mental health condition feels like it worsens during the holiday season.
Yeah.
So those statistics, I think it just kind of like brings home that we need to have these conversations about why right now is hard. So how do you feel about those kind of like pieces of data?
Well, my gut reaction is like, God, like it went through my mind as you were saying those stats. It's like, that's just, it's sad, right? Like the holidays are meant to be like we all gather and we all just like love on each other and celebrate, you know, whatever you're celebrating for the holidays. But really it's supposed to be like a time of connection. And for a lot of people, it feels like it's a major time of disconnect.
Oh, for sure.
And I guess that's just because everyone's just kind of, you know, you have your friends and you do your like Friendsgiving or your friends like Christmas. Like we had a couple little Christmas parties together. But those are like your chosen family. You know, it's your chosen love. Whereas sometimes you go in and you're like, okay, my friends are going to their families and now I'm going to my families. And, you know, I have been very grateful that my family is really cool. Shout out to the Ferraris and the Purdy's and all the peeps. But there are like changes. Like I only have one grandparent now. And that's been a huge change because before we would spend all of our Christmases in Michigan with my other grandparents and we'd get to like see snow and we were all together. Whereas like now as I'm turning 29, like our holidays are getting smaller and that becomes really sad. Is seeing that like we used to have such a connection of all the different families come together as one, and now I mean it's kind of just like my unit of like there's like 6 of us on a good day,
right?
Especially being an only child. So there's that of like just seeing the change of there's fewer and fewer people in our holiday traditions, and then also like thinking about where I am in life currently. I know we're going to get into this in a second, but like looking at everyone's getting married or they have new babies or they just have like all these exciting things. And like I got my baby, which is our business, but
and Penny,
of course.
Puppy.
That's right. My real girl. But just like looking at that and being like, oh, that would be nice to have that right now. But you know, I'm trying to be very grateful of the spot that I'm in, but it still just kind of like sucks a little bit.
I also wish that like we were in a place, I think like systemically, where people value and celebrate like the birth of a business just as much of a birth of a child, even though very, very different, of course. And there's certainly not the manual labor and like the hormonal exhaustion
Yep.
and birthing the business like there is in like bringing a child into the world, but it's just as much of an accomplishment.
Yeah.
I will say, I actually think about celebrating Christmas with your family a few years ago. For anyone that doesn't know this, I briefly lived with Caroline and her family. After we graduated from grad school, I took a job out where they lived, and it was hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half, maybe, from my apartment. And so I stayed there for like 3 days a week, every week. And one Christmas, Caroline's family like welcomed me in, and we all celebrated together. And that's still like one of my favorite Christmases, just because it was a very weird time in the world. It was 2020, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 2020. We were in the midst of COVID, and then coming off of masks and
the election. There was an election that was happening.
Yeah, there was an election.
A big one. And so I do think that was just like a really fond memory. But I do think that, though, you're right, the further we get into holidays and the older we are, it just, we start to notice the people that aren't here anymore and just the things that we miss. So when we really think about why people feel stressed, obviously there's the grief aspect. We talked about the financial aspect of the holidays, especially in a climate of overconsumption. And I do feel like there's this like feeling of you have to do everything, but that's never enough, which is interesting. I actually talked to my parents about it over the weekend when I was telling them what we were filming today. And I was asking them, I said, hey, like, what causes you guys stress? And it was interesting because they were talking about what we were just kind of saying of like things in their life that causes them to just, their blood pressure to get a little bit higher around this time of year. And that was that like overarching theme of like, they want to do everything for everybody, and sometimes like they aren't priority anymore, and they end up being exhausted, and it's just never enough. Like, how did that happen? Like you said, holidays should be a time of like connection, and people just end up exhausted and sad.
Yeah, I was watching, I don't remember if it was a TV show or a movie, but it was this week actually. It was on Monday.
You watched a Christmas movie?
I know. For all of you guys who don't know, I'm not big on like Christmas music. Sad. I do watch Hallmark though, but that's mainly because my dad loves Hallmark.
Have you seen the Biltmore one?
No.
You have to watch it.
I guess I do. It's at the Biltmore?
Yes.
Ooh.
It's amazing. It's like a throwback movie. It's like set in the 1940s, but with the actress who plays Haley James Scott in One Tree Hill.
Is that the blonde?
She's a brunette.
She's the brunette.
But not Sophia Bush, so not Brooke Davis. Oh. But she's incredible. It's on Netflix until the end of the year.
That one out. Yeah,
it's my favorite. But yes.
But I was watching one of those mainly because, and to bring that up is because I was with Monica, my roommate, and she loves Christmas movies. So we were watching that, and the character in it literally said, "I hate the holidays." And the person was like, "Well, why do you hate the holidays?" He said, "Because it's never enough." And you always feel like you're always trying to do more. And sometimes you just have to recognize that not everyone's going to be happy. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's so true. So Hallmark movie just really getting into the feels. But yeah, it's 100% true of like, it feels like it's never enough or it's never done the perfect way. And it's like, when did that start to be a huge thing that mattered? Like when we were kids, I think back to that, it was like
great.
Just being in December felt magical.
There's got to be some kind of like threshold of responsibility. So it's like if you cross a certain threshold with a certain kind of responsibility, that's when you start to feel that pressure.
Yeah.
Or I know for me, like I feel pressure to make everyone feel happy and magical, even if I don't.
Yeah.
That's my own thing that I'm trying to work on, though, is like setting my own realistic expectations for the holiday. And then the let them principle, which we'll talk on later for sure.
Yeah.
But I also feel like it just really stresses the importance of boundary work, which I feel like it's just so overused in social media.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like every TikTok or every reel, it's like, how do we set boundaries? And like, hot girls set boundaries.
No, yeah, that's 100% true. I feel like it's a buzzword right now. It's like boundaries. But then I have clients that come in and they're like, oh, I don't actually know what a boundary is or like how to set one or what that even means. And
genuinely.
I'm like,
So, okay, then for you, so like therapist brain, why are they important? And like, what even is a boundary essentially?
So, and I take a different kind of approach to boundaries just because I bring it in from a biblical perspective. So I always explain boundaries, but I explain them like boundaries like Jesus.
Okay.
So the way that I look at boundaries is they're meant to not only protect me, but they're also meant to protect the other person as well.
Oh.
So like I know that if someone oversteps and is like crossing my boundary, I'm going to respond in a manner that I'm not going to be proud of later, because like you just popped into my bubble and I wasn't ready for that. And so I kind of look at boundaries as like a mutual thing, meaning that like I put them so that we all feel safe. And so when it comes to like the holidays, like one of my biggest boundaries would always be like don't comment on how much I'm eating or how little I'm eating.
Please don't talk about bodies or food or weight.
100%. And then also, you know, in my family, we are very Southern. And so when we do like the whole big group, you know, people are getting like married and engaged and having babies. And it was always well, when is it your turn? Well, is that happening? And so a boundary for that might look like something like, if we're having boundaries like Jesus, something where I respond kindly, but I also don't let people walk all over me. So like for me, that's a trigger. Talking about what my relationship's going to look like in the next whatever, when I'm getting married, when I'm getting engaged, that's like one of my big trigger things, just because I am a huge timeline person. So I know like if you talk about it, I'm going to feel feelings. So it might look like saying something like, hey, you know, I really appreciate you caring about what's going on in my life, but that actually brings me a lot of stress. And so I'd really love if we could maybe just like change conversation, or we'll talk about that later.
Do you say it that way? Genuinely?
No. So typically what I will say is like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, because I know like when I talk like about setting boundaries with clients and with myself, I say the same thing, but then in practice, it can sound, honestly, sometimes I like joke it off. So I'm trying to get better at like actually setting them. I know how I intend.
Oh, I'm not the best at setting boundaries, because like, I don't know if you were taught this, but essentially we were taught that boundaries are kind of disrespectful. Yeah. Like you're disrespecting the person that you're talking to. And I see that a lot of times with my clients too, which is why I implemented that idea of like boundaries like Jesus. Like you're not meant to say them to be unkind. You're meant to say them so that, you know, like you can have your own self, and so that you feel good walking away from that conversation. Now, of course, we're all a work in progress, but even saying like, well, I don't know, that can sometimes be a boundary too. Yeah, because absolutely. You're just saying like, hey, I'm just going to shut down this conversation and then move on.
I've never heard it framed that way, especially in a biblical sense, just because obviously like I don't do faith-based counseling and therapy. I've never considered that. That almost seems like a nice like side door without a lot of the shame. Yeah. Because it's very like compassion focused. Because when I talk about it, it is still compassion focused, but it's very like interpersonal, and like you can tell I'm a big IFS gal when I talk about it, because it's very similar in concept. It's always like we're going to talk about, if we're going to think about like fences and armor to put up, you're obviously like keeping yourself protected from things outside, but it's just, again, it's a barrier. Yeah. And I always like to say that boundaries have to have two parts to it, and I like to use a snake bite analogy. I don't know why I used a snake bite analogy, again, because
do you like snakes?
I am like very afraid.
That's what I was thinking.
Like specific phobia, kind of afraid. There's clinically significant distress for snakes. So the fact that I use it, I don't know. I guess I'm like desensitizing myself over time.
Ooh, systematic desensitization. Yeah. You CBTing?
I guess so. But it's interesting because when you were like, yeah, I like to talk to clients about setting boundaries like Jesus, I was like, I talk about getting bit by a snake. So, you know, very different
what styles. It could be one and the same, you know.
So I like to talk about it because I feel like people forget that setting a boundary has two different parts to it. One of them being your own internal work with yourself, and the other one being setting a boundary with someone who's ready to receive it. Because I feel like some people think that like, oh, if I set a boundary with my like closed-minded insert relative here, everything's going to be better. Yeah. It's like, no, if you set a boundary with someone who's not willing to receive something, you're just offering a statement. And so that's when I bring in like the snake bite. And I always say, okay, if you were bitten by a snake and all you do is call animal control, call your friend who can happily dispose of the snake, if you're me, or like for me, it would be like my spouse. I just called Ryan and I said, please help me. So say like you got bit by a snake and you have someone else dispose of it for you. And then you're asking like, why am I still in pain? You haven't addressed the venom. in your own body.
Ooh.
And so that's why I like to talk about boundaries, of having those like two different elements to it, of you do have to do your own healing before you even get there.
Yeah.
To set a reasonable expectation of what you want. And then you have to set a boundary with someone who's willing to like have some kind of conversation with you.
I love that.
Thank you.
That's a great way of saying that.
I don't know how it came into my brain.
I don't know, but I might have to steal it sometimes.
This is going to be clipped to the Instagram at some point, but we should.
Sure. And I love that you mentioned the difference in how we look at boundaries, because it's always different. It's different on who you are, but it's also different on the other end, just like you said, of like who's receiving it. And there's some people that like, I don't have to set that boundary with.
Yeah.
So like if, let's say for instance, my dad were to ask, so like, when do you think that this is going to happen? Or what does your timeline look on this? Yeah. Like, that's someone that I'd be like, okay, I really want to have this conversation with you. I feel comfortable with that.
Sure.
Whereas if it's like my 10th cousin down the line, whatever, that like I don't have that kind of vibe with, like that's someone that I might set that boundary with, because it doesn't feel like intentional to me.
Sure.
Like it doesn't feel like you're asking because you care. It feels more like I'm asking because you're not aligning with everyone else.
Yeah.
And it also brings up the point, this is totally off topic, so just bring me back whenever I'm ready, but that like all counselors are different.
For sure.
Which is why it's so important that like we do present specialized care, and that we say like, hey, if we're not vibing, let's find you someone who is, because someone might need to hear the snake bite analogy, whereas someone else might need to hear like a boundary like Jesus.
Right. I'm even thinking about like some of my clients who like might not respond as well to like a snake bite kind of anecdote and connection, but others who actually might feel like more comfortable, and they might even feel like it's more acceptable to set a boundary if there's a biblical undertone to it. So I think just like different strokes for different folks.
Oh.
And so I do think that you're right though, and it touches on like honestly like kind of steps to set a boundary, which we have shared on our social media, so at Soul Haven Counseling on Instagram. But I do think that the first step in setting a boundary is defining your expectation as to what is healthy and healing for yourself. So like I know you've touched on it, and I feel the same way, as I don't prefer comments about like my physical self, my body, or about like any sort of like food consumption.
Yeah.
And so you really have to think about, okay, if I want to set a boundary that's about hearing comments about like aesthetics or food, what does that look like with the people that I'm very close to, or someone that I'm just kind of at a table with and I don't have a relationship with?
Yeah.
And really starting that work and kind of recognizing that these things do come in layers. So obviously we have that first step of awareness, and then our own expectations of ourselves. Because I feel like if we don't include ourselves in setting a boundary, that is pretty hypocritical.
No, I agree for sure. Like 100% that first step is about figuring out like where are your trigger moments of like what is going to impact me in this certain way.
Sure.
So, we talked about like body, food. We talked about life transitions.
Yes.
That's a big
one. Like just like the next step or the next chapter.
Yeah, whatever that looks like. Or even like if you're in college and someone's like, well, how is college going?
What's your major?
Yeah.
What are your grades like?
What are your grades? Yeah. What's your GPA right now? Do you have plans for after college? That kind of thing. And then there's also this next one that we're just briefly gonna comment on and talk about: grief.
Yes.
So, I've had a long like transition with grief in the holidays. Mine's kind of been very dispersed. I believe I lost my first grandparent when I was, what was I, maybe like 13. So I've kind of like had that grieving process going from very early on, and it's obviously changed as I've gotten like older and older.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned, I have one grandparent now, and so like even processing that, like Bobby, I love her, she's 90 years old and she is like still kicking and riding her bike and like being active.
It's amazing.
But it does come into frame of like thinking about what that could be like for the future and how that feels.
So is that a boundary that you set, either with yourself or somebody else, is like the presence or the absence of grief?
I think that I set that boundary with myself, because no one in my family we don't really talk about it.
Sure.
We have done things like my dog Charlie. We named Charlie after both of my grandparents, my grandfathers. So like his name's Charlie Modesto Ferrari. We call him Charlie Mo. And Charlie was was my pawpaw, and then Modesto was my grandpa. And so we've kind of like tried to make sure that we still honor those who are not with us currently. But we don't have very frequent conversations with that, and it's all because of our heart stuff, obviously. Sure. So I think that that's more of like a boundary I set with myself of like, we're gonna enjoy the moment as it is right now.
So obviously, like, we have our expectations of ourselves and what that looks like, and I think that brings up a good point of not talking about something is a boundary. And just know that like when you're setting a boundary, you're not forced to have a conversation. You're just giving yourself power to decide what that conversation could look like. So obviously we have the element of like defining your expectations. Then I think like the next step would be something like thinking about the ask in this question of, okay, if I'm going to ask something of someone to make this a healthier environment for me, what would that look like? Does it look like changing the subject and not talking about it? Does it look like saying, hey, like, I don't know, aunt whatever that's asking me about when I'm going to have children, or someone who's asking when a ring is coming, or whatever that looks like. I think the next step would be really defining what you would like to see from other people, but then also like finding an appropriate time, because I truly cannot imagine the idea of like setting a boundary with someone who wasn't regulated. I feel like that's just an argument, actually.
Yeah, and typically when you are in the midst of like the holiday season, like you're at that party, you guys are getting ready to have dinner, everyone's dysregulated.
Sure.
Because no one knows where they're going to sit, no one knows what they're going to eat, no one's knows like, is someone going to like my dish, or am I going to hate everyone else's dish, or what is this going to look like for my body later if you're Caroline Ferrari and have toileting issues. So 100% of like setting up that environment of what that looks like, and then also setting like real expectations on how that's going to go down.
And I think a good trick for that, because I know for a lot of people who might be listening, they might be thinking like, okay, well, if I can't set a boundary at the dinner table, then like, how do I even do this? I think a good tip that I like to give people is having a buddy. So if I'm like imagining my extended family, because now like my immediate family is myself and my husband, now my extended was my old immediate family, which is kind of wild to think about. But what I would do is I would like loop in my spouse, and I would say, okay, hey, you know that I'm uncomfortable if these comments are made. Can you help me? Or actually, he and I both, like, we typically have a code word or a code phrase if we just need help, or if we need to be rescued from a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really healthy boundary, because that means the people who are most impactful to you know where you're at. They know like that these topics aren't healthy for you, and they can also help you kind of rotate the conversation in a different direction if someone that's a little bit further from you brings it up, because obviously like, they don't have cruel intentions. No, they might just be making small talk.
Right.
So I'd say that's a good tip, though, is like understanding the environment and the context, because you're right, no one is regulated at the dinner table. Especially not like when I'm thinking about like my past, like an Italian family Christmas.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Who is loud?
It's never like dysregulated in a bad way.
No, it's
loud.
There's a lot of energy.
Yeah.
In an Italian room.
Sure.
There's lots of big personalities.
Yeah, it's the best though.
It is. I love my Italian family.
So then obviously, so we've defined our expectations, and we're thinking about like our ask and what that would look like. So then as we bring it in and like the final part of this, how would you recommend someone set the boundary and then also just enforce it?
Well, I definitely think you brought up a good point of like there has to be forethought to it.
Yeah.
You don't just like come into the situation, you're like, I'm just going to do this on the spot. I mean, if you can,
great.
Awesome.
That's a pro level move.
I was about to say, like, maybe you need to look at a counseling career.
Yes.
Because like I can't do that. So definitely like thinking beforehand and kind of like, I totally forgot your question.
So how would you recommend enforcing and like setting the boundary? So like bringing it on in, like you have the planning in your head. How do you make it happen?
There we go. So enforcing is showing up to that space, knowing your intent first and foremost, but then also like processing, I don't know, like how do you show up in a space but then be compassionate while also trying to hold yourself as the center. And for me, that looks like the what's it called? The feedback technique.
I was about to say, is it the feedback sandwich?
Yes, it's the feedback sandwich of like start with a positive or of like a, I appreciate this or like a, thank you for blah, 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 blah. Just kind of like creating that buffer of like the first one, something nice, something fuzzy. The middle, your actual boundary.
Yeah.
And then the end of following up with like, maybe we can talk about this later.
That's
or maybe
a
we can have
fantastic way
another
to set a
conversation.
I love that.
And that's kind of like the way that I've always processed them.
Yeah.
Is having little buffers because like I need a buffer. Plus in school they teach you like 2 to 1.
Yeah.
Well, actually they teach you 3 to 1, but
it's a little excessive sometimes.
Yeah. 3, that's pretty tough. So like we're gonna give ourselves 2 to 1, just kind of like make a little sandwich out of it.
I like that also because it gives room for the person you're talking to have their own reaction. Because again, I think people look at boundaries as like a one-sided act sometimes, but it's not. It's a 2-person conversation. And the person you're setting a boundary with like is allowed to have a reaction, and you aren't responsible for how they feel. And I think that leading with that feedback sandwich of like the pro, the boundaries, and then ending with some kind of nicety or something like that can help them remember that whatever you're saying is in kind. And it's something that is out of love and out of care and wanting to have that healthy relationship, because the healthiest relationships are the ones with boundaries. And people think that like setting a boundary means that it's toxic, and like, that could be an environment where that does happen. I think that boundaries are a way to protect yourself, but it can also be a way to strengthen really good relationships too.
And to like piggyback off of that, people think that it's toxic, but also people assume that like that person is toxic, and that's why you're setting a boundary.
They're not at all.
No, like that does not mean that you have a bad relationship or a poor relationship with that person, or that they have malintent, or that they're a toxic human.
It could be sometimes.
But it doesn't have to be. Like sometimes it's with literally yourself. Like you have to set a boundary with yourself or with your partner or with your parents. Doesn't mean you don't love them. It just means like right now you are not in a spot where you can have that conversation or you can do that task or you can even think about that conversation, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I love that. And I do think that we'll definitely continue to have these kind of conversations about boundaries because I think they're helpful. But if you're listening to this and you probably experience some kind of holiday stress, don't be afraid to set those boundaries in your life. And if you do continue to have that anxiety and stress around setting them, feel free to talk to your therapist about it. This is their job to kind of give you the skills and the coaching and the encouragement to feel confident in doing this, knowing that the first few boundaries you set are really scary. I remember the first few I set as an adult. It was really scary.
They're still scary. Oh my gosh.
Right. But like you will get to a point where they're easy, and like there are a few boundaries that I do set on the fly. There are some topics that like I do need to prep myself though. So I think it's just kind of an evolution. But I know that we briefly touched on holiday grief, and we will have a separate episode that is recorded and released later, and I'm sure at a time where I am immensely regulated, because grief is definitely a hot button for me.
Because that's a boundary that she is setting.
It is. But what I do want to say is we can't record an episode about the holidays without talking about grief. And if my voice starts to fluctuate, it's because grief is very near and dear to my heart, and that's okay. And I think that if anyone is listening and they are impacted by grief, or someone they love is, what I think you should know is invite your loved one's grief to the holiday with them. That is something that I've heard, and it really resonated with me, because something about the holidays is people don't think that their grief is welcome because it's not holly and jolly and it's not sparkly. And I think it's, my voice just went up an octave at the end of that. My husband told me I have that sometimes. It's very true. It's when I get uncomfortable. Shout out to grief. Makes me uncomfortable. And so I think obviously encourage someone to bring their grief to the holidays with them. And I think it's when you're in those one-on-one conversations is bring it up. And especially if you're very close to that person, bring it up and use the person's name of who they lost. I think that's something that really resonated with me. And the nicest things, like when you check on me, you'll use the person's name specifically. And that's like all I ever want to hear is their name, to know that they're not forgotten. And I think it could be those statements of like, hey, there are some empty chairs at this holiday now, and those might be really loud. Is there something that you want to do to remember insert person's name here? or is just asking enough. I think just like inviting that conversation is huge. So that's if someone that you care about is going through grief. If you are going through grief, you don't have to feel that alone. And like, I'm not an expert on grief. I'm just in it a lot. My own therapist actually said something very profound the other day, and she was like, well, we can be in grief or we can be with grief. So we can be alongside it or in it. And every day is different. In the holidays, you're in grief a lot. But I think it's just like letting yourself ride those waves is really helpful. Actually saw it yesterday. One of my favorite Pure Barre studios in Athens, they released a grief special for their workouts.
Oh, wow.
And you literally call them and you're like, no, I would like the grief special. And you can have like unlimited classes for free if you just need to embrace movement, which like, that's my way of coping.
That's amazing.
Right. And like, that's why I always tell people, like, if the emotions don't feel safe to access because they're painful, move your body if you can.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, that's what I do. So
yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on holiday grief?
I think I don't enjoy working with grief. I honestly don't even enjoy thinking about it.
Right.
Which is why I mentioned earlier, like, we don't talk about it in my family. And that's mainly because that is a huge boundary that we put up. Like, we will not talk about it on the holidays. We talk about it around the holidays.
That's actually really great.
And that's mainly
boundary.
because, like, we don't want it to feel like it's only meant for special occasions in my family.
I like that.
You know, like, for us, like I mentioned, like, my dog's name is my grandparents' name.
Yeah.
So we say it, like, every single day because Charlie gets into some stuff. But that's kind of the way that we honor those who have passed, is we tend to talk about them, like, regularly.
Yeah.
Almost, you know, not to desensitize, but to bring them into our everyday life.
It's like you're keeping them in your family.
Yeah.
I really love that.
And that's something that, like, when I've had clients who've lost someone, they always say, well, I just want to, like, forget about it. I just want to forget about it. And I always ask, like, well, how come? Like, well, because it hurts. I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense. But I always bring up that picture of, you know, the ultimate goal is not to get rid of grief, but it's more to grow around it. And it's that little picture, I think it's like a jar or something.
The jar, yeah.
Yes, and it has the little ball of grief, and then your jar just gets bigger, and then your little grief ball gets, like, smaller.
Yeah.
It's like it's creating space for it in a capacity that's healthy and good for you.
It's my favorite grief analogy, I will say.
Yeah.
And like, and grief doesn't always have to be sad, like you said. Like, it can be very, like, every day. Like, actually, on the way to our, like, holiday party that we went to the other day, I listened to because Ryan was asleep in the car, and it was just kind of me driving, and I listened to Frank Sinatra's Christmas album, and it's one of my favorites, and I love it. And it just felt really, like, it felt really good. It felt kind of like a hug from somebody. But then, like, there are also sometimes when I'm passing down a tradition now and I'm doing it by myself, and I don't know, I'm just, like, crying over an apple pie as I'm baking it, and that's okay. And I think it's just kind of deciding what you need and moving forward accordingly with a lot of grace for yourself too.
Yeah.
Grief isn't
and
easy.
recognizing that it's not the same, and that there is no timeline, and that days are going to be different. Just like your therapist said, like, we can be in it or we can be with it. And it's like, some days we're really going to be with it. Yeah. And then some days it's going to feel like we in it.
Yes.
So it's just, and it just varies, you know? And I think that just giving yourself space to be like, every day is going to look different. And around the holidays, if you want to do something to, like, honor those who are not currently there, like, that's beautiful. But then also, if you want to, you know, just kind of move forward, and then maybe we talk about them the next day.
Sure.
That's it too.
Absolutely. You don't have to move through it alone.
Yeah.
So I think that it's, like, a nice segue when we talk about the waiting room mentality of the holidays. And we've definitely touched on it a lot. And I bring this up quite a bit with my clients who are in their 20s and 30s. Yeah. Is that there's so often we are in this waiting room of life where we're anticipating the next chapter, whether it's another degree, whether it's a major life milestone like an engagement, a marriage, a child, whatever that means. And a lot of the times the holidays can make being in this waiting room very uncomfortable. But I also think it's ironic because we're in the waiting room of our life more than we're actually experiencing these events. We're thinking about, like, the time spent there. So why do you feel like it's that uncomfortable during the holidays?
I honestly think it's like a microscope. Yeah. I look at the holidays like you're under a microscope.
Or like, why aren't you there yet? Why are you still waiting?
Yeah. Whereas, like, in everyday life, we're not having those conversations like that.
I don't even think about those things.
No, we're just like vibing with our day.
Yeah, like if I think about the two of us in our respective waiting rooms, I don't think about yours like ever.
No, I'm more like, yo, what you got today? Like, how's the day going?
How's it going?
How was your workout this
How are
morning?
you?
How are the dogs? That kind of thing. But then I also think it's because a lot of people use the holidays as a time to catch up.
Yeah.
Like with the people they have not seen.
And those are good like landmarks for catching up too. You're right.
Of like, you haven't seen your 10th cousin since last Christmas. So like
last transition zone.
And like they follow you probably on social media. So they're looking and they're waiting. I know that it's funny. I had this conversation with my school counselor who I used to work with in the school system. And there's like teachers asking her all the time, like, oh, you know, when are we going to see that ring for Caroline? I remember her talking about that boy and like all of those things. And it's because they don't have a direct line to me. Yeah. And so she's the only person that communicates with me on a regular from there. So they all go to her. And I think it's kind of that same concept of like, if you're not speaking to family members, to friends, whoever regularly, like it's a time to almost catch up and see like, oh, how's life? And most people want to comment on the things they know the most about. Sure. And for a lot of people, that is like education, work, relationships.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, that brings up a good point. And I think that's a good way that we can also connect that to the boundary setting, and especially this idea of like setting your own expectation and realizing that if someone's asking you about, hey, when is this happening? When is that happening? There is a good chance they're not asking to put pressure on you. Yeah. They're just wanting to know where you're at. And so it's figuring out, okay, if I get questions about this, how do I manage my own reactions? And if this is potentially triggering for me, while also making sure I have a connection with this person if I want it. Yeah. Because it is hard. And like people associate waiting rooms with discomfort, the disgruntled person that's in the waiting room talking about whatever they're wanting to complain about. But like we do live our life typically in like the waiting room period, and it doesn't have to be bad.
Yeah. It's just a part of it.
Right.
You know, it's that 30 minutes, possibly 3 hours if it's a really important one, that you just like sit in there and you just vibe. But then once you go back, you get your answers, you move forward, and you leave, and you keep going.
And I feel like there are like some like of these metaphorical waiting rooms that people also don't talk about. And it's things like if you're someone that's waiting for retirement, or you're approaching retirement, or if you're someone who like has an aging parent or recently lost a parent and you're navigating life before or after that big milestone, people literally don't talk about those big changes. Yeah. And so I think it's just kind of giving grace to yourself and the people around you, and knowing that like, hey, like we're all in different waiting rooms right now, or we're in the thick of moving from one to another. And so when we're having these conversations and catching up with the people, maybe just asking things in a different way, and maybe being more curious instead of saying like, where's that ring? Saying like, hey, like, how is it going? How are things going? Like, what's been making you happy? Have you been traveling at all? Like, what's going on in your life? I think just starting things in that way feels like a little bit less pressure.
Yeah. I love that example of like just switching it a little bit. Yeah. Being like, instead of I don't know. I view that as very direct when you say like,
it can be
hey,
intimidating.
When are you retiring, or when are you graduating? Instead of just, you know, like saying like, I don't know, like, how are you enjoying college? Like, what's next for you after this?
Just being curious.
Like, are you traveling? I love the bringing up, like, what are the fun things that you're doing?
What's making you happy?
Yeah.
It was funny. I was actually talking to someone on Sunday, and something that was really funny, and it was a topic of conversation where we got to catch up in a different way. I joked in the fact that I didn't feel like I had hobbies. And so the three of us were like, what are hobbies even? And like, what are things that we love to do and like aren't quote unquote productive? It was such a fun conversation, because then I ended up talking about like, the books I was reading, like embroidery and paint by number. And I heard about like what they love to do. And I just got to learn more about them, which was really neat.
Also, the fact that you said that you don't feel like you have hobbies. You walked in here today and gave me a whole thing of homemade fudge.
It's tiramisu fudge. Oh, be careful. There's espresso powder in it.
Ooh, I can't have more than like
be careful.
2.
It's not that much, but just be careful.
Yeah, because you know me.
Yes.
I don't drink a lot of coffee.
So just a heads up.
Yeah.
So I think that everything we talked about today really brings up my favorite kind of mentality that I've been really clinging to this year. And it's Mel Robbins' let them theory. Have you heard of it?
No.
Oh my gosh. I think you're
Let
going to love
them
it.
theory?
Yes. It's, she's actually, I don't believe that she's a psychologist or therapist. She's just a public speaker in like the wellness and like self-development realm. And it's letting other people be in charge of their own emotion. And I feel like, especially for you and I, we love to not, it's not about control. It's about caring and nurturing for other people and people pleasing. But it's literally this idea of letting people have their own feelings, and you are not responsible for theirs. You're only responsible for yours and your own expectation.
Which is wild that even has to be said.
But it's huge.
But it's so huge. Like me, I get so focused on what everyone else is feeling, and I try and like manage that and make sure that I'm being the best person for them. And it's like, I sit and I tell my kids constantly, who are you in charge of?
Yep.
Me.
Yeah.
Are you in charge of anyone else? No.
And
Same
so
thing with feelings.
When she was talking about this let them principle, and it's something, you're right, it's so simple in concept, but in execution, it like makes me sweat sometimes, because she started listing off all these scenarios, and she was like, oh, is your blah, blah, blah in-law upset that you didn't wear this to the family gathering? Let them be upset. And this idea of like, oh, is your boss upset that like you're taking your PTO that you're legally entitled to have? Let them be upset. And like she kept going on and on of like, let them have this, let them have that. I was like, this is incredible, but oh my gosh, that's so daunting.
I love that. Well, it's a lot like Brene Brown. She talked about writing yourself permission slips.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly that.
Like I mean, I've used this actually with someone. I said, get out a little sheet of paper and say like, okay, well, I feel like maybe I shouldn't go and work out today because I have to do my math homework or whatever it is. It's like, write yourself a permission slip. I am allowed to go and work out before I do my math homework.
That's like to let them for yourself.
Yeah.
I love that. Huh. So I'd say I definitely want to encourage both of us, because we people please.
Yeah.
And then anyone listening, to utilize the let them principle, but just making sure that like this is a tool meant for good and not evil.
Right.
It's not like letting people suffer.
Yeah.
It's if you are truly moving through these different like boundary setting experiences and you're wanting to show up authentically as yourself, is allowing the people around you to have whatever reaction and experience that they need to also have that health for themselves too.
Yeah. I love that. And use it for good, not evil.
Please.
Like most things in life that we talk about. Oops, I forgot to turn off. Oh. Well, to go ahead and start to close out, we're closing out 2024.
Wow.
It's been a whole
I definitely
year.
thought it was 2023 still.
Thank God.
Now we're going to be in 2025.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moving into January. I mean, we have 2.5 weeks? Is that how much time it is?
Well, this is definitely going to be our last episode of the year for sure.
Yes, it is. So for Sarah Erdman Jordan.
Yeah.
What are the things,
That's
I know,
so weird.
wild. What are the things you're taking from 2024? What have you learned?
I think this was a year where, not in the first half of the year at all, but I'd say in the last quarter of the year. So I want to bring this into the next year. I'm not a resolutioner at all, but I like to set intentions.
Yeah.
I'm just anti-resolution for my own reasons. Maybe I'll get into that in our first episode of the new year. But I really want to encourage myself to continue to take up space. Something I do a lot is I shrink myself down and I water myself down for the comfort of other people. I even noticed it. My sister-in-law, Adrienne, is actually wonderful at bringing this into a conversation with me. She says it a lot when she actually asked about her business and I was telling her about it. And she was like, don't water yourself down. Like, you can talk about it. This is great. And like, even when they looked at the office and I said, oh, like we want to change this and do that. She was like, Sarah, like, no, this is great. And so I think something that I'm taking from this year and into the next year is taking up space and not watering myself down. And the let them is letting people have whatever reaction that they need to. I'm going to try.
I love that.
It's really
You're
hard.
just like clapping back on life right now.
I'm trying. Well, I think it's because I was a chameleon for so long. And I honestly thought that was a positive trait in myself.
Yeah.
I just realized it was just a people-pleasing trait. And I like lost my kind of identity and all of that. So taking up space, not watering myself down, and just kind of leading with compassion. What about you?
So I feel like this has been the year of, one, me really like finding solace in my faith. But I think the biggest thing that I'm taking from 2024 is this idea that, like, if it's meant to happen, it's going to happen.
When I think about your year, I think of a lot of transition and like a big waiting room year, which is really hard.
Yeah. It's been so hard, but oh my gosh, it feels like so good. Because there's so many things in 2024 in my life right now that, like, they just feel normal and they feel enjoyable. Like, there's not the ups and the downs. Like, even our business, I don't know if we've ever talked about this actually yet, but I know us just personally, we've talked about how things have just felt like they fell into place.
It matches our personalities and our strengths beautifully, I will say.
Like, even just like starting up this whole thing and the idea and the name and like what we're going to do, it's all just like,
it just happened.
Yeah. And like, of course it takes work. Like, everything in life takes work.
We haven't slept much in the last few months.
Do you see my eyeball twitching?
Whether it's because we're working or we're stressing.
Yeah. And it's going to bring like some areas of stress and anxiety. But at the same point, like, I feel so much peace and so calm in life right now. And this is probably one of the biggest years that I've ever had within like my adulthood.
I love that.
And so I think that's what I'm taking into the next years, like, that if it's meant to happen, it's going to happen. That I don't have to force things,
like releasing control.
And almost just being like, okay, and I know that's crazy, right?
Wow,
crazy for me.
That's
my
great.
Type A-ness. But yeah, I'm trying to just kind of like let things happen.
I love that. So it's a let them, letting things happen, letting people do whatever they need to, and the rest will work itself out. That's fantastic. Well, thank you all for hanging out with us for our last episode of 2024. We will catch you back in 2025 with our first episode of the new year, which we haven't decided yet, but it'll be great. But if you need us or you want to keep up with us, definitely give us a follow on Instagram at Soul Haven Counseling, Facebook, or on our website, www.soulhavengeorgia.com.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.